The side deck. Just 15 cards you throw together because it's just part of the game, right? Everybody has one, so you gotta have one too. I feel like it's a part of competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! That people typically spend the least amount of time on when they build a deck, yet it is one of the things that people ask me about the most whenever I post a deck list. How do you build the side deck? What's your siding patterns? So today I'm trying to cover as much about the side deck as possible. As someone who's been playing this game competitively for a long time, won multiple YCSs, I'm hoping it's going to help people to get better at this aspect of Yu-Gi-Oh! And maybe we can even take a look at how the side deck has evolved over the course of the years. Quick side note before we start, in today's video, I'm going to be using as an example list to illustrate some of my points, my Mitsurugi deck list that I used at the French Nationals this year. I finished first after Swiss with it and ended up losing in top 32. I'm going to be using it to illustrate the points that I'm making and show you the examples and how I arrived at that side deck, just to make the points clearer. If you're playing a different deck or you're watching this at some point in the future, don't worry. I'm going to be trying to make these points as generic as possible and just use the Mitsurugi deck as kind of like a way to make examples along the way, just so we have something to look at and illustrate these points. They're still going to stand for whatever deck you're playing, and as long as you just look at the generic advice I'm giving, I think it should still be helpful. Why is it so important? Well, the answer to this is simple if you really think about it. So in a Yu-Gi-Oh! Tournament best of 3 setting, you really do play about 2/3 of all your games post-side. Of course, I mean, some matches only have 2 games, but the majority have 3, and 2 of those are played post-side, one typically with you going first and one with you going second. So having a proper side decking strategy for all these scenarios against all these different decks is going to be crucial for any kind of success in competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Just think of all these times a card you sided in for a specific matchup won you the game and the match, or how bad it can feel to draw a card that's bad in a matchup, but you simply couldn't side it out because the cards left in your side deck are even worse. All right, but where do you start? The way I like to think of the side deck is as a way to fix weaknesses and problems of your main deck, and also a way to improve your game plan for specific situations. When you're preparing your main deck, it kind of has to work in all kinds of situations. You got to be prepared for different matchups and find a balance between going first and second. When you're siding, you know most of these things already. You usually know what deck you're going up against at that point, and you also know who's going to be choosing first or second. With that information, you're trying to optimize your deck to have the best chances to take the match. Taking a first look at the example deck list here just to see what we're working with. Not trying to talk too much about how I reached this specific main deck, because today's video is about reaching a side deck, but it's always hand in hand, right? The main and the side deck always go hand in hand. You need the right number of cards to take out and cards to take in, and you want to cover for problems. So let's take a look here. We've got 6 more Charmies in the main deck, which was a call to cover for Mitsurugi Raziel, as well as the Droll and Lockbird, of course, which are relatively targeted tech choices, which means that the main deck is already pretty teched out for the format and for specific top tier decks in the format. So the side deck is going to have to cover for the decks that we are not covering with the main deck yet. And that means we're going to need answers for decks that aren't Mitsurugi Raziel. And it also means we're going to need ways to take out these Charmies or the Droll and Lockbird in scenarios where they aren't good. Like whenever we're going first, we're going to have to take out the Charmies, and whenever Droll and Lockbird or other tech cards are not great in a matchup, we're going to have to take those out as well. Just a first glance of which kind of cards we're definitely going to have solutions for in the side deck. So the first thing you want to do when finding cards for your side deck is finding the decks that you want to side cards for. Now, obviously, I mean, this is obvious, but this is where you need to be aware of the format in some way, shape, or form. And this can differ sometimes depending on what tournament you're even trying to attend. You know, it's a lot easier to maybe have an overview of what's being played at your locals, and it sometimes is a lot different from what's being played at big tournaments. You know, it's, of course, it would be good to have something in your side deck for the best deck in the format, but if no one's playing that deck at your locals, then essentially you're wasting those side deck slots as well. But in general, if I'm assuming you're preparing for a big tournament where you're going to face the meta, then I like to look at it in 3 different categories, basically, where category 1 is decks that you definitely have to expect facing. These are the top meta decks. These are the decks that you want to have a very good game plan against, and even maybe side some very specific cards for. The second category would be decks that are less popular, and you can realistically play against these decks, but not as often, and you might even go an entire tournament, even with a deep run, without ever facing one of these. And these you definitely want to have a plan against, because it's realistic that you will face them, but you don't need like a very specific answer to it. You're trying to cover these maybe with some more generic cards that work in multiple matchups, or try to cover 2 or 3 of these decks at once with a certain card, and just in general understand how your side deck works against these and have something prepared. Whereas the third category is decks that are not popular enough to realistically prepare a side deck specifically for them at all, where it's like rogue decks that even if you end up facing them, it's probably just once the entire tournament. And these decks, you don't really need a side deck plan. Now, you could, of course, just ignore these decks altogether, but the way I like to go about it is you want to understand what these decks do, and you want to understand which cards in your side deck that you just naturally put there can maybe work in those matchups as well. So if there's a card that you put in your side deck because it's good against one of the top meta decks, and it's also good against one of the rogue decks, that's a bonus, but you also need to understand that. You need to know that in the first place. An example of this is Nibiru the Primal Being, a very common side deck card in general, for good reason, because it covers some meta decks often, but also a lot of the rogue decks just randomly are weak to Nibiru. This is something where you have to be familiar with it, though. You have to understand that when you're playing against a rogue deck, is Nibiru good right now or is it not? So cards that have this sort of multi-purpose can definitely have benefits over more specific cards, simply because they cover more rogue decks. But it's something that you shouldn't overdo. Like there's a point where you don't need to prepare for every single deck you might play, because ultimately some of these decks are rogue decks for a reason, and it's more likely you can beat them without even siding specifically for them. All right, example time. Now that we've already established earlier what kind of cards we might have to take out in certain situations, but we'll do more on that later, the decks we're trying to side for with this particular deck are definitely Malice and Mitsurugi Raziel. Those would be your category 1 decks that you will probably not go a single tournament without facing a bunch. Category 2 decks that we want a plan against, but are not our main focus, include stuff like Raziel variations, like Raziel Heraldic, Mermail, Memento, Fiendsmith decks, Blue Eyes, Crystron, and maybe Odeon. Those are the kind of decks that I would like to be prepared for, as well as pure Mitsurugi, of course, which is slightly different than Mitsurugi Raziel. Everything else, I think, falls into category 3 of decks that it's nice to know what you can side against it, but you're not trying to side specifically for it. Looking at our example deck list here, this is a deck where, going first, I do not side out any engine cards in this Mitsurugi deck, because you really want to make sure that you can play. Luckily, I have the Molcharmies here, so I have some room to side out cards going first, which we're going to talk about in a second, what I'm going to do in that scenario. But generally, in this deck, going first, I'll be taking out non-engine cards, and going second, I'll be taking out some engine, plus maybe some of the non-engine that might not be good in a certain matchup. Like if Perulia doesn't hit a certain matchup, I'm going to side it out. If Droll doesn't hit a certain matchup, I'll take it out, so on and so forth. You get the idea. And that's basically how I work out the number of cards that I can remove from my deck, both going first or going second, by simply taking a look at my main deck and understanding the popular matchups in the format, and understanding how many cards am I going to need for those matchups. How many cards do you even side? So now that we've established which decks you need to prepare for and which decks you can ignore, what's left is how many cards do you side for each matchup, and how do you identify the cards that you want for those matchups. For the number of cards you side, I think that heavily depends on a few factors. The first thing is, how popular is that deck you're trying to side for? The more popular the deck is, the more often you're going to play against it, and the more mileage you're getting out of these slots in your side deck. And since side deck space is so limited, you want to be very efficient with it. But not only the popularity is a factor, it's also about how much of a problem a certain matchup even is to you, because some decks naturally just have pretty good matchups even against some of the more popular decks, and sometimes, especially with the more popular decks, you might already have a lot of tools and answers against them in your main deck and don't need to side a ton on top of that. As an example here, in my deck for French Nationals, I was already main decking Molcharmy Fuvalos, Molcharmy Perulia, and Droll and Lockbird to cover for Mitsurugi Raziel because it was so popular. This meant I already had a pretty good matchup going second into the deck and didn't feel like I needed much of a side for it. On the other hand, Droll and Perulia were not as good against Malice, so I wanted more slots in my side deck to cover that specific matchup, which is why I sided Lancias as well as additional copies of Nibiru the Primal Being. And then, generally, just what deck are you playing? Because some decks that operate with low engine counts and can play with just a few cards can afford to side more, while decks with a very high engine count that want or even need to draw 2 to 3 or even more engine pieces to even get going simply cannot afford to take out as many cards, since what you're siding is typically non-engine to counter the opponent. Of course, there are exceptions where you side more engine, but we'll cover that later. So it can be completely fine to just have 3 cards in your deck for a very popular matchup if your deck simply can't afford to take out much of its engine. This is really where you need to know your own strategy and understand how many cards can I afford to take out. I will say in this particular instance, I think it makes a huge difference on whether you're going first or second, because I typically don't like to side out a lot of engine when I'm going first, simply because I'm going to be operating on a 5-card hand and I don't want to be like inconsistent with it. I don't want to not open a play just to open some anti-cards for my opponent's deck. But when you're going second and you know you're getting that 6th card, I think statistically it's completely fine to take out a couple of engine pieces, because you know you're going to get an additional draw and therefore you are less likely to draw an unplayable hand. Another scenario in which even maybe a more powerful combo heavy deck might want to side deck cards specifically for going first, if the deck has specific counters that you're very afraid of. Like, let's say Malice right now is very afraid of getting hit with an Artifact Lancia, and as a way to prepare for that, people are siding cards to essentially turn skip the opponent back, right? They're using copies like Triple Tactics Thrust alongside some very popular or powerful one-of trap cards for different matchups. And then when you get hit by a Lancia or even a Molcharmi Fuvalos that essentially makes your turn 1 not as combo heavy as you would like it to be, you have a way to do the same thing to your opponent. Speaking of going first versus going second, going first is good in Yu-Gi-Oh! 99% of the time. This is why, generally, I don't like focusing much of your side deck for going first. Remember earlier when I said I like to focus on covering weaknesses and problems of a deck, and if going first isn't much of a problem, I don't think there's a huge point in trying to fix that when you're going first post-side. I like using the side deck to patch issues a deck has, and most decks simply don't struggle going first. Now, as always, there are exceptions to this. Some decks are just naturally less powerful and make less oppressive boards, in which case siding a couple of cards for going first might be appropriate if the other meta decks could just run you over. Otherwise, another reason to side deck cards for going first is when you're main decking some stuff that you just need to take out when you're going first, simply because the cards don't really work. Like when you're main decking cards like Evenly Matched or Dark Rule No More, or as like a more relevant example currently, as I did in the French National Championships, I main decked the 6 Small Charmies, which absolutely need to be sided out versus any matchup going first. So in this case, you definitely need cards that you can side in independent of the matchup, basically, because you have cards in your main deck that, independent of the matchup, need to go out. So in this case, you need cards that you can side versus everything. So some like Solemn Judgment, Solemn Strike come to mind and are very popular choices in these formats. I personally really like using those slots for cards that can also be used when going second. For example, at French Nationals this year, instead of siding the standard Solemns that a lot of people were using to take out the Charmies, I instead used additional copies of Ash Blossoms, Nibirus, and Bystials, since I could also use these to cover more decks when going second, and they're still fine side-ins for going first. However, of course, they're weaker than Solemns in that specific scenario, but I valued the flexibility more than the high impact in fewer scenarios, and that's exactly what we're talking about next. So, flexibility versus impact. Now, as we all know, for most Yu-Gi-Oh decks, there are some pretty heavy counters out there. Most of the time, floodgates or specific hand traps, lingering effects, etc. allow you to easily shut off a specific deck. Now, the problem is, with only 15 side deck slots available, if you're trying to cover for as many matchups as possible and also account for having to go first and sometimes second, you're going to run out of slots very quickly, if not at least some of your side deck has like multi-purpose and can be used either first or second, or against multiple decks in the format. Generally, I only like to side super specific counters if a deck is either super popular or very hard to beat otherwise, or both. Like current format example, Artifact Lancia is a card that's very popular, and that's simply because Malice is both popular, powerful, and very good at playing through most other hand traps. So there simply aren't many other more flexible alternatives. Sometimes even more rogue-ish decks can call for specific answers, like Luanda Reese in Tearlament format, which wasn't the most popular deck, but since it was like a super ignorant deck using Dimension Shifter, and besides Tearlament, you didn't really have to cover many other decks, players still often wanted specific answers to Luanda Reese, which goes to show that in formats with fewer decks, in general, you can obviously side more specifically, even for less popular decks. Rule of thumb, of course, the more diverse the format is, the less you can afford to side specific cards to counter a specific deck, and you're going to want to look for more flexible options. Finally, I want to talk about the entire side deck and explain the entire thing as a whole with the concept as we've just talked about in mind, because I think this is kind of like a good way to recap this entire thing, because I realize it's a lot of input and making a side deck is not a linear process. It's very iterative. You have to go over and go back and change things and iterate over things, and so often multiple of these concepts combine into one decision, and that's why I think it's good that we just take a look at the side deck as a whole and talk about some of these reasonings and concepts that we've just discussed. So for everything else, before we talk about the individual choices, this is where I usually go about and count how many cards I can side in and out in a certain matchup. And of course, going first, I knew I could at least side 6 cards in any matchup, but going second, it's a little bit more tough because the Charmies usually stay in the deck at that point. And unless Droll and Lockbird is bad in a specific matchup, you don't really want to take out any of your non-engine pieces going second. So going second, basically the number of cards I can side in is slightly limited by how much engine am I willing to take out. So here are the cards that I considered siding out, or that I was willing to side out going second. 1 copy of Aramasa, 1 copy of Mitsurugi Ritual, 1 Night Sword Serpent, depending on if I needed the extra power in the pushes, 1 copy of Pre-Preparation of Rites, the copy of Triple Tactics Talents and Called by the Grave, because they don't really help much in breaking boards in this format. And sometimes I was willing to take out the second copy of the Murakumo, which makes a total of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 essentially engine cards that I can take out when I'm going second. And then of course, sometimes in some matchups, I can take out one of the Charmies if it's not great, the Droll and Lockbird, or even the Dominus Impulse. Let's say against Ryzeal, Dominus Impulse, not that great. So we're working with around 7 to 10 cards we can side max going second, which is honestly not bad. That's more than a lot of other decks have, and that is because Mitsurugi is a deck that functions mostly on 1-card combos and has a decent amount of engine in the deck, and taking out some engine going second doesn't really hurt you. Now, I will say, I'm not siding out all of those engine cards every single time. It really is something where I only want to do that against combo heavy decks, because if a deck is very combo heavy, then I'm willing to take the risk of bricking maybe a little bit more than when I'm playing against a lower powered deck, where I would rather keep some consistency cards in. So let's say against a combo heavy deck, we can side upwards of like 7 to 10 cards going second, but more likely it's going to be like 6 or 7 cards in other matchups. And this is where I just go down the list of decks I want to cover, basically. I didn't want to side anything for Mitsurugi Ryzeal, anything specific, because I already had all the best cards against Mitsurugi Ryzeal in my main deck, which is Fuvalos, Perulia, Droll, and Lockbird. Now, I will say, if there was another card that was really good against Mitsurugi Ryzeal, I probably would have made space in my side deck for it. However, I simply didn't think there was one, which is sometimes also a legitimate reason to not side deck for a deck. If you don't think there's another good card, then you can't really put anything. So I didn't really have much in my side deck for Mitsurugi Ryzeal. However, I did have stuff in my side deck for Malice. Now, against Malice, I don't actually want to take out that much engine, because I want to keep most of my non-engine in the deck against it. I want to keep Impulse. I want to keep the Charmies. I do want to side deck Nibiru's and Lancias for it, so I'm going to have to side deck at least 5 cards. And I usually took out the Droll Lockbirds against Malice alongside 1 copy of Aramasa and 1 copy of Mitsurugi Ritual for just 3 Lancia and 2 Nibiru's. So at that point, the side deck has Lancias, Ash Blossoms, and Nibiru's, as well as the Mitsurugi Trap card to cover Mitsurugi Ryziel, Malice, and going first in general. So we have about 6 slots left to work with to cover some rogue decks. Now, to be fair here, we are not like bad against rogue at this point because we already have Charmies in the main deck, we have Ash Blossom, and we have Nibiru, so we're covering a lot of rogue decks. Something we don't cover with this deck, which is actually a pretty big weakness for it, is Schmidt decks with Caesar, because Caesar is a very strong card against Mitsurugi. So this is where the Bystials come in. This is where I really liked the Bystials because they can function as going first cards as well, and they work against a lot of different stuff in the format. Let it be Fiendsmith decks, which can make Caesar, but also Mitsurugi, as well as Blue Eyes, and a lot of other rogue decks can suffer against Bystials. Like, they're solid against Memento, and they have some other applications. Like, Bystials will always find an application. And that's why I really like Bystials in here. I wanted to play a fair chunk of them because Baldrake is also pretty good in Mitsurugi because it can tribute your own Mitsurugis. And that's why I arrived at 4. The exact reason why I arrived at 4 is because the other 2 cards that are in my side deck also felt mandatory to me, which was the Wosu, which is in here because of the concept of flexibility, the ability to search this card. I mean, of course, it is not better than most other cards in this side deck, but it is highly searchable. And that is why I really liked the 1-of copy to answer Caesar more consistently. I mean, against the Fiendsmith deck, I would rather draw a Bystial to prevent the Caesar than I would like to draw the Wosu to tribute it. But I do think this being searchable over a Bystial being not searchable makes it statistically a very, very good inclusion in the deck. And then there's a 1-of Dimension Shifter, which I felt like there was no reason not to play because it's one of the best cards to cover a bunch of rogue at the same time. It doesn't cover Malice or Ryziel Mitsurugi, but it covers basically everything else in the format. All kinds of combo decks like Mermail and Memento and most other rogue decks. I mean, there's so many decks that are weak to Shifter, and this deck doesn't really suffer from Shifter a lot, so I decided it was a worth inclusion, even though it was just a 1-of, because it's limited, but it covers so much ground that I think it was solid. And so that's how I arrived at this side deck. I was very happy with it. It covered all the things I wanted it to cover. You know, it covers going first, it covers Malice, Ryziel Mitsurugi is already covered in the main deck, and I think we've talked about the plan against all of the other rogue decks as well. I think you can work out with all the tools that you've been given in this video. I'm pretty sure you can work out exactly which cards are going in against which of the tier 2 decks and which cards I'm taking out, and I think you'll find that this list will have a very, very solid plan against almost anything you could realistically come up against in the current format, which is ultimately the goal of a side deck in my opinion. So I was pretty happy with this, how it turned out, and this is why I also used it as an example for this video. There are some other concepts about side decking that weren't really present in this side deck, but I still wanted to bring them up just for completion's sake for today's video. So now we're going to talk about some more niche strategies and some rarer concepts when it comes to side decking. In general, like I mentioned earlier, I'm a huge fan of using side deck slots efficiently, and if you put any 1 card in your side deck that you can't search, your odds of that card impacting a game simply boil down to the odds of hard drawing it. And if you include a card that is searchable though, even as a 1-of, you have a significantly higher chance for it to come up. Of course, it depends on how searchable is that card, like how many cards in your deck can access it. But like a lot of archetypes have ways to search cards of the same archetype these days, and not every archetypal card is good enough to make it into the main deck. Like in Mitsurugi, one example would be their own kaiju, quote unquote, the Wosu, right? That contribute opponents' monsters, which I sided at French Nationals just as a 1-of, so that a lot of cards in my deck can turn into and out to something like a DDD Wave High King Caesar, which is just very efficient because it just takes up 1 side deck slot, but I get like multiple answers to the Caesar. Now, of course, a lot of Yu-Gi-Oh cards are very powerful but not searchable, and you don't always have this option, it's just something I wanted to bring up so that people are on the lookout for it. Like I like just looking into the cards that I could theoretically be searching, and if anything, if that's worth it. All right, now we're getting into some more niche strategies when building a side deck that you still should be aware of being an option. And some decks simply struggle with extra deck space and would really like to have a certain extra deck monster for certain situations. Like, for example, sometimes you would really like to have a Charmer for, let's say, the mirror match, but you simply can't justify playing it in your extra deck because the mirror is not that common and it only comes up when you're going second anyways. In these cases, it can still be a very efficient use of a side deck slot, because remember how we talked about searchable cards earlier, extra deck cards also don't need to be drawn. You're going to have access to these every single game you have them in your extra deck, basically, and that is also pretty efficient. Other examples can be specific tools for going second, like Access Code Talker, cards that counter certain matchups like Abyss Dweller when it was still legal, or cards like Gagaga Cowboy, of course, for time. Speaking of time, of course, time rules are something to consider in competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! However, I personally feel like, I think a lot of people feel like they need something for time in their side deck when in reality they really don't. Like, using cards to specifically help you win or at least not lose in time, it can be quite helpful since technically it isn't matchup dependent and can help you against every deck in the format. However, in every matchup that doesn't get close to time, these cards are going to be completely useless, and I think it's best to only side cards for time if a deck struggles with it inherently. Like, reasons for this could be that a deck always has to pay life points to use some of its most important cards like Sprite Starter or My Friend Pearly, or a deck simply is really slow and can struggle to stay ahead in life points at all times because it's more control-y, like Runic, which doesn't even have a battle phase to get in damage. So in these cases, I think siding a card for a time is fine. In other cases, I wouldn't recommend. Smoke screening. This is more of an honorable mention since it only happens very rarely, but there is a technique that I know under the name of smoke screening. I don't even know if that's the official term or anything like that. It's basically an idea where you hide an entire engine in your side deck to swap out the deck you're playing between games, causing your opponent to side in the wrong cards for the matchup essentially. For example, like, I've seen people do this a couple of months ago. I feel like there were a few people who were hiding an entire Tenpai engine in their side deck. Like, they were playing, I think, Malice with just 15 Malice cards in the main deck, and you take out all the 15 Malice cards for an entire Tenpai package, and your opponent would obviously be side decking cards like Lancea and choosing first against you, and then you would try to punish it by having an entire Tenpai core in your side deck. Now, the advantages of this are pretty apparent, and you know, you can catch some people off guard with this. However, it also comes with some pretty heavy disadvantages, which is why it tends to not be very relevant most of the time. I just wanted to bring it up for completion's sake. But like, having to take out all the 15 engine pieces for 15 other engine pieces in your side deck means you can never really do anything else. You never have the ability to take out a bad non-engine card in the matchup, and you can never side in specific answers for a specific deck because typically you simply don't have room for it. And in general, you can even only do this if you can find two engines that consist of 15 or less cards and work well together in the sense that they have different weaknesses. Like, for example, people siding Lancea against Malice, which does nothing to Tenpai. So there's only very, very few instances in Yu-Gi-Oh's history where this has been done successfully. But I wanted to mention it because it's a pretty cool concept if you can pull it off. As someone who's played Yu-Gi-Oh for a very long time, I feel like the role of the side deck has changed a decent amount over the course of all these years. In the early days of Yu-Gi-Oh, it felt like the main purpose of the side deck was just to patch weaknesses and take out some suboptimal cards for slightly better ones in a matchup to just gain a little bit of an edge. Like, you would side back row removal against back row heavy decks, or you would use soft counters like pulling the rug against a Monarch deck. But the more cards and archetypes were printed and the more powerful decks became, I feel like the side deck has turned more into a hard counter machine these days, where everyone tries to find the best ways to floodgate or auto-win certain matchups. Of course, it's also heavily tied in with the existence of these floodgates in the first place. Cards like Harpy's Featherstorm, Dimensional Barrier, Different Dimension Ground, you name it. It's just some examples of cards that are still left in the game and widely agreed upon that they're not good enough to be main decked due to simply being trap cards. But when people know they're going first, players just want to win the game by using these cards, which is natural. Don't really blame the players here. If you want to win, these cards can be optimal to play. Note, can be. We've talked about it earlier, and I don't think siding cards specifically to auto-win going first is always the best idea. Often I think it's actually not ideal, but like generally I think people just tend to overdo it a little bit with these floodgates when a lot of decks are just naturally at an advantage going first and would be better off using slots for other cards. Still, these options exist, and personally I would enjoy the concept of the side deck a lot more if it was actually used the old-fashioned way, where you just try to slightly optimize your deck for different matchups instead of just slapping the best ways to turn the next game into a non-game for your opponent. We will see how this develops in the future. I mean, they have handled some of these cards in the last couple of years, and who knows, maybe they'll keep hitting them until a lot of them are gone. For now, I really hope this video helped you better understand the side deck and how to build one for your own deck.